Welcome to the 2022 Genetics Pop-Up from Mountain States Regional Genetics Network. We thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to join us. And our theme today is Ask a Genetic Navigator. We'll explain a little bit more who genetic navigators are in just a second. But we'd like to just start off by a little bit of Zoom etiquette and speaker etiquette. We are offering ASL interpretation today, and so I'll be giving some tips for that as well. So I know we've been all using Zoom for a long time, but some people might be joining us who are new to it. So just a reminder, you can unmute and mute your lines down there at the bottom bar where the number 1 is. Number 2, you can turn on and turn off your camera if you feel comfortable. We are recording the very first section of this talk up until the Q&A portion. So please do whatever you feel comfortable with your camera. You all were muted upon entry, and we will allow you to unmute once we get to the Q&A portion. Number 3 shows you the active participant list, and number 4 is the chat. And that will be important for our Q&A section. If you don't feel comfortable speaking your question and you would like to type your question, you can also use that chat for technical issues that you're having. You can message myself, Christy, or we also have Katie Bradley joining us, who's helping us on the technical side, so you can message her or myself. Next, as I said, we have 2 interpreters, Sydney and Matthew, who will be alternating signing for us today, and they can also be pinned. The way you pin an interpreter, the active interpreter, is by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of the interpreter's box and selecting Pin Video. I'll give everybody a chance to find that if you need to do that or would like to do that. We will recommend that during the Q&A portion that we go into gallery mode and unpin the interpreters so you can see everybody who is asking the questions. One other note that we'd like to highlight to help make this as accessible to everyone as possible, we would like to ask, when you are asking a question, please raise your hand. If you've never raised your hand on Zoom before, you can look for the smiley face at the bottom bar. And when you click that, there's a raise hand button. We would ask that you wait to be called on and then state your name when you begin to talk. By stating your name, that will help the interpreters and the live transcript be able to identify the speaker. Also, if you're looking for a live transcript, you can look for the closed caption box on the bottom strip of your Zoom, and you can click show subtitles in that box. With that, we'd also like to acknowledge the funding for this program. We are a grant funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We appreciate them funding Mountain States as a program, as well as this activity and event today. With that, this is just a little bit of an overview of what we'll talk about today. We have an icebreaker, but don't worry, you won't be put on the spot. So we'll get started warming up our brains around genetics. We have one of our genetic navigators who's willing to share their own family story with us today. Then we have a video about questions that our genetic navigators had when they were navigating genetics with their own loved ones. And then it's your turn. It's your turn to ask your questions and for us to provide answers and resources. As I've said before, we are not experts. We are not medical professionals. So we may not have all the answers, but we'll try our very best to point you in a direction for you to get some information, some resources, and take your next steps. All right, so here's that icebreaker I was talking about. If everyone can find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and open up your chat, what do you think of when you hear the word genetics? If you could type that in, add your thoughts in the chat about what you think of. And this is just one of those, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word genetics? DNA, genetic disorders, genes, family, rare disorders, characteristics and traits, great one. Something related to DNA, wonderful. Research, good one. This graphic here has a lot of words on it, but these are just some of the words that we've heard over the last couple of days as we've been doing our genetics pop-up. And these here also are some word clouds. I know we've heard a lot about CRISPR technology in the news, gene editing. Also with COVID, we've heard a lot about RNA and mRNA. So these are also some other words that might come to mind when you hear the term genetics. All right, now that we have our brains warmed up around the term and the concept of genetics, we will be focusing today a little bit of our information on childhood genetics and genetics that impact families and children. And it brings me to this question: do you know someone with a genetic disorder? And I just want to preface this with the word disorder is used interchangeably in the medical field with the terms condition, genetic disease, genetic diagnosis, genetic difference. And so whatever your preference here is, I'm just quoting some of the research that is out there, but these words can be used interchangeably. So these statistics come from the Department of Health Services in Texas, which is one of our states. And 1 in 9 children admitted to the hospital in the United States has a genetic disorder. 1 in 12 adults admitted to the hospital have a genetic disorder, and 1 in 22 people in the United States have a genetic disorder. Unfortunately, 20 to 30% of all infant deaths can be attributed to a genetic disorder. Said another way, this study just came out with some of our partners at the National Coordinating Center. They did a study of the prevalence of genetic conditions specifically in children, and they used the data from the 2016-2017 National Survey of Children's Health. So on the left-hand side, you can see a graphic depicting 100 children. So if you think of 100 children that you might know either through your workplace, your school, your friends, your family, this report came to the conclusion that 3.9%, or about 4 children out of 100, have reported having a genetic condition using that 2016-2017 data. So that might seem rare, but I know some of you are here because you know someone or have a loved one with a genetic condition, and for you that might not feel rare. Others might be here today just to learn more. Others might work with families and just want to know how to support families with genetic conditions. We just provide some of this background data and numbers just to give you a sense of the prevalence of genetic condition in the United States. We also have these genetic pop-ups around Rare Disease Day, which was this past Monday on February 28th. It's on that day because it's the rarest day of the year, and especially with leap year. And so these are some of the infographics that were presented for this year's Rare Disease Day. And I share these here as well because this puts some genetic conditions in light of this. The reason we have these genetic pop-ups around Rare Disease Day is because for Mountain States, we do not represent just one genetic condition. We represent them all. And so Rare Disease Day is one of the times that a lot of genetic conditions people are made aware of them. So 72% of rare diseases are genetic. 70% of genetic rare diseases start in childhood, and there are over 6,000 identified rare diseases, which impact 300 million people worldwide. This Rare Disease Day event is a worldwide event, and there are events happening all over the world, a lot here in the United States. I took part in the National Institute of Health's Rare Disease Day, which was recorded. So if you're interested in that, that's happened on Monday. And then in the Mountain States region, these pop-ups are what we do to help raise awareness and talk about rare diseases and specifically genetic conditions. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our genetic navigators. Back last year at this time, we had an application out asking for individuals to apply to become a genetic navigator in the 8 states in our region. We asked for individuals that had previous experience navigating genetics for their own loved one in the state that they lived in. These 8 individuals were selected last spring and went through training in May and June and began navigating with families in July. We have Known from Arizona, Jamie in Colorado, Jen in Montana, Hannah in Nevada, Jennifer in New Mexico, Lourdes in Texas, Tristan in Utah, and Melody in Wyoming. And some of them have joined us today to answer your questions. So I'm excited to introduce you to them in just a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce you to just one genetic navigator. Her name is Known. She is from Arizona, and she has so graciously been willing to share her family's story today about their genetic journey. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen here.
So my name is Known Dublinsky, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. My journey with genetics began in 1992 with the birth of my younger daughter, Elizabeth. I mention the year not because I really want you to know how old I am, but because my personal story is bookmarked by 2 significant genetic advances. In 1989, 2 years before my daughter's birth, the gene that causes cystic fibrosis was discovered. Cystic fibrosis is a progressive, life-shortening genetic disease that causes chronic lung infections and limits the ability for children to breathe over time. 30 years later, in 2019, a powerful therapeutic, a pill named Trikafta, that my daughter now takes daily, was approved by the FDA. And while not a cure, Trikafta is one of an entirely new class of drugs called a corrector medication. And it basically corrects the damaged protein caused by my daughter's specific genetic mutation, and it allows the protein to function in the way that it should. This is significant when you consider that only about 5% of those 6,000 plus rare diseases have a treatment right now. So I think that my personal story sheds light on how one such rare disease moved from gene identification to treatment. So my younger daughter, Elizabeth, was born a totally uneventful pregnancy and birth. We brought her home. We had no concerns, but she quickly began developing symptoms of concern. At the first week checkup, I asked about this cough that she had. She was then hospitalized at the age of 1 month with pneumonia. She wasn't growing. People out in public would comment on how pale, almost translucent her skin was. So I know this is a familiar experience with many other parents, that in those 4 months, I took her to multiple doctors, multiple emergency rooms, until finally at the age of 4 months, I took her into my pediatrician because of a diaper rash. And the pediatrician weighed her and was like, oh my gosh, because she saw how her growth was so stunted. And at that time, she recommended that my daughter have a sweat test for cystic fibrosis, which is still the gold standard test for CF, because regardless of what specific mutation you have, it's about 98% reliable in diagnosing CF. And all it does, they put a little like heating pad on their arm and collect sweat, and then they measure how much chloride is in the sweat. And children and infants with cystic fibrosis have really high levels of chloride. So she was diagnosed at 4 months and had genetic testing about a year later that identified her specific mutation, which is the most severe. It correlates with the most severe disease progression, but also is the most common mutation. About 70% of people with CF have the mutation that my daughter has. So a diagnosis at 4 months, I know for many parents, they're like, that's wonderful. That was such an early diagnosis. But in cystic fibrosis, it's really considered, a late diagnosis. I don't think she would have lived to her first birthday if we hadn't have gotten her treatment when she did. So when my daughter was diagnosed, I was referred to the local children's hospital to their CF clinic. And that's where my daughter began receiving care from medical specialists, specifically trained and experienced in caring for children with CF. At the time, I had no idea that these CF clinics were located in every state. I think I thought, oh, this was like a hospital organization thing. Like we all go to this one clinic, we have CF, but actually those specialty care centers were established by the CF Foundation. And the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, or the CF Foundation, is a nonprofit disease-specific organization funded by parents of children who have CF in the 1950s. If I had to pick one underlying theme in my own experience, it has been the power of collective parent advocacy. When she was in the hospital, I was asked to sign consent forms to enroll my daughter in the cystic fibrosis patient registry. Again, I had no idea how unique this patient registry was. The CF patient registry was established in the 1980s, and it revolutionized treatment for children with CF in multiple ways. One way was by using data gleaned from the registry to make recommendations for treatment. One of these recommendations that had a huge impact on outcomes and children with CF living longer was the recommendation that treatment that now they knew children with CF needed to be bombarded with calories. So my daughter, because of, they call it pancreatic insufficiency, the digestive enzymes that help us all digest fat and protein, they're blocked in children with CF, which is why they don't grow. And at one time they thought, and it's really painful, they get tummy aches when they eat too much fat or protein. So the recommendation early on was, a low fat diet, not too much protein. It's hard for them to digest. And then they looked at data from one CF center that was pushing higher calories, and those children were living significantly longer. And so my daughter was always on a really high fat, high protein diet. And it's funny because when she was, 7 or 8, 9 years old, our house was always the house where her friends wanted to come over and have a sleepover, which made me so happy because I thought, I love being the fun mom, and it wasn't until later when one of the other mothers said, oh no, it's those chocolate milkshakes you make every night before they go to bed. So we were the house that had, bacon and whole fat chocolate milk. And so anyway, so I was asked to enroll her in the patient registry, which I did. And then our family went on, we were busy with just all her medical treatments. And as many families in the rare disease world knows, we were just busy with, paying our medical bills and fitting all her treatments into the day. I think probably it was about 2 hours a day of medical treatments for Elizabeth when she was growing up. But we also participated in fundraising. And so that was another unique thing about the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Ever since the 1970s, the CF Foundation has almost exclusively used its fundraising to support research for a cure. I think one of the researchers' mottos was, believe in God, fund science. And at the time, the use of this fundraising and the targeted fundraising for research was really controversial. In the 1970s, parents of children with CF felt strongly that the money that they raised in their local communities should be used to support the local care centers that were keeping their children alive. But ultimately, the national headquarters, CF Foundation, won the argument, and fundraising was targeted to support research for a cure. And I'll be honest, at the time, I did not realize how unique that was, that they were targeting so much of their fundraising for research. But our family felt the benefit. My daughter's entire life, there was just a flow of new medications. I think when she was 2 years old, it was DNase, and it was a medication that thinned out the secretions in her lungs and helped her breathe. By the time she was 5 or 6, she had inhaled antibiotics. Early on, we just had to use IV antibiotics and put them in a nebulizer and just hope some of it was getting down into her lungs. So the treatments just continued to improve. Also that ongoing development of new medications was actually another benefit of the patient registry. Again, I didn't know any of this. I was just a mom, trying to keep my little girl alive. Because patient registries attracted researchers, because it made it easier for researchers to do their job. They had all this disease-specific data to work with. And patient registries also attracted pharmaceutical companies because they could then take that research and transform it into therapeutics. And patient registries make it cheaper for some pharmaceutical companies to run clinical trials. And I think, and that was a big thing that the CF Foundation supported, was clinical trials. I think 40% of children and young adults with CF, including my daughter, have participated in clinical trials for new therapeutics. But still, the drug development costs money. So how did the CF Foundation raise enough money to develop these medications, you might wonder? So first of all, the parents spearheaded the fundraising, and parents also brought in philanthropists like Bill Gates. Bill Gates just happened to have an engineer that worked for him in Microsoft that had 2 children with CF. So he donated $20 million to the development of therapeutics for CF. The CF Foundation then identified biotech companies to invest in. And so this originally parent, initiated, funded, disease-specific organization invested in early research and development of cutting-edge medications. And then they negotiated royalties in exchange for this investment. And this process is called venture philanthropy. And you might hear that term in the field of, rare disease research. But the CF Foundation eventually sold its royalties, and it's now worth $3.3 billion. It is the largest nonprofit disease-focused charity in the country as measured by its assets. And this is an organization that was started and funded by parents. So when my daughter was diagnosed with CF in 1992, the average lifespan for a child with CF was 28 years. And the median survival age for a child born with CF today is 30 years. And those children born today, there's their expectation that with the treatments they have, they'll live to see a cure. So in summary, I think that my family's journey with genetics has taught my family the power of collective parent advocacy and the power of science. So thanks for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Noan, for not only sharing your family story, but the story of parent-led organizations as well, and research. Thank you so much for that. All right, now I'm going to share my screen and share a video with you so you can hear from some other of our genetic navigators as they share what questions they had when they were first beginning to navigate with their own children. So give me just a moment to get this up. Hello, and thank you for a few short minutes of your time. Let me tell you a little bit about the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network. Who is Mountain States Regional Genetics Network, or MSRGN for short, you might ask? MSRGN is a regional network consisting of 8 states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and we are funded federally by HRSA that funds the 7 regional genetics networks, which includes MSRGN, along with the Family Center and the National Coordinating Center. The mission of the Regional Genetics Networks is to increase access to genetic services for individuals and their families, including those who are underserved in our region. In 2021, Mountain States Regional Genetics Network selected 8 individuals who had navigated the genetic journey for their own loved ones in their own state. These individuals became our genetic navigators and are now available to help families navigate genetics. Genetic navigators offer resources, guidance, and navigation to others from a perspective of someone who has been there and done that and has been on a genetics path and journey for their own loved ones. Sometimes we all just need a helping hand. The ultimate goal of the program is navigating to hope for families who may be filled with questions, who may be looking for resources, or who may be experiencing barriers to accessing genetic services in their state. Anyone who has ever been on a genetics journey has been filled with questions. Today, we will be sharing questions that our own genetic navigators had when they first started navigating for their own families.
I think the biggest question I had when we first started thinking about what we needed from the genetics world was how to get that genetics referral. My son had Down syndrome diagnosis at birth. And so the idea that we would need to revisit genetics was hard for some of the specialists to wrap their brains around, but because he was declining rapidly and no one could come up with a solution, trying to navigate that route to getting the actual referral was more difficult than I had anticipated. So that advocacy piece of being able to say, this is why I want genetics for my son and why I think it will be helpful. I think those are the questions that if I had been more prepared to answer, maybe I would have been able to get the referral a little easier.
So I didn't have a big question starting out the genetics journey with my family. Having worked in healthcare and worked with kids with many of the known genetic disorders. So I was fairly confident that my children didn't have one of the known disorders. And I was skeptical that we would even find anything since whole exome and whole genome sequencing weren't available at the time. My main concern was getting some sort of diagnosis or report that would allow me to get services for my children, insurance coverage, and to find direction in how to help them.
This question I have all throughout the process, but a part of the process that stands out to me is when we had just started our genetic testing journey, and I started conversing with other rare families and went to an international or a national conference on rare disease. And I started to learn that not all hospitals were the same, not all doctors were the same. And so that became my question, is like, how do I know what's really available to my child for genetic testing? Because I'm realizing then that it depends on the doctor and what they want to offer, and of course insurance. And so I had to do some research. I still don't think I could completely answer that question.
I think my biggest question was what now, which feels very broad, but with our condition, there was so many things to plan and do. We went from just having some very general therapeutic services to needing so many specialists, to needing to add insurances, to figuring out access to doctors who even knew what his condition was. And it felt very overwhelming. We had not, thought about genetics. We weren't looking for a genetic diagnosis. So I didn't think genetics until the day that we got our diagnosis for our son when he was 1. So you don't just get hit with your kid has this condition, you get hit with, and now we've got to do this, and we've got to apply for this insurance and we've got to put all these things in place. And so that first couple of months was just so overwhelming. And then treatment too, like treatment was very overwhelming with all of the things that we suddenly knew that he needed, and he needed it now.
I think the biggest question I had was my daughter was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. So they use what's called a sweat test. It's sort of the standard test for diagnosing CF. And it's just they collect sweat and they measure how much chloride. And then infants, young children who have really high levels, that's a positive for probably having CF. And then my daughter had genetic testing. So I'll say going into genetic testing, I was just so relieved to have a diagnosis because she was a really sick little baby. I was just so relieved. And when they did the genetic testing and then came back and told me these letters and numbers, you know, Delta F508, I wanted to know, what does that mutation, how does that impact her? Because cystic fibrosis, at that time, they knew there were hundreds of different genetic mutations that cause CF. Now they know there's at least 2,000. And I wanted to know, so this mutation correlates with what? Like genotype, phenotype. This mutation correlates to what severity of disease? So I had questions about that. And then I had questions, I think like most moms, what can I do? What can I do to keep her healthy? What can I do to make sure she lives as long as she can and has the best quality of life? Those were my biggest questions.
I appreciate the opportunity to think about this question. It took 12 years for us to diagnose my daughter, and the whole time we were working with genetics. So the biggest question I started to have was, what happens, or how do we proceed when you have a person who you think has a genetic diagnosis, but every year and every test you do comes back with no answer? And for us, that was to do the whole exome sequencing.
Thank you for your time today in listening to our video. If you would like to connect with the genetic navigator for your state, please go to the Mountain States website, www.mountainstatesgenetics.org/GN. There you will find our 8 genetic navigators and their email address, and you can reach out to them and contact them that way. In addition, if you have further questions about Mountain States or would like to connect with our network, please reach out to us on the Contact tab at our website. We'd also like to thank our funders, HRSA, for their support of our program. Thank you so much for taking a moment to listen to our video and listen to Noan's story. And now we are going to take just a moment for a break and ask you to look at the chat again. I'm going to pop up our slides one more time here, but we have actually a gift card drawing that we would like to invite you to participate if you are interested. The gift card drawing is completely optional, but we have a form if you would like to participate in the chat that you can fill out. We have it in English and Spanish, that gift card form, and it just asks you a couple of pieces of information. We need to collect this information to be able to give out the gift cards per our funders, and we will be notifying the winners by email early next week. So if you would like to take part in that gift card drawing, just as a thank you for being here today, thank you for taking time out of your day, please feel free to fill out that form. If you choose not to participate, that's totally fine as well, but we also do still thank you for being here and being part of our presentation today. So just make sure everybody's been able to find that. Thank you so much, Katie, for popping that into the chat there. And if you have any trouble opening those links, please let us know. All right, with that, we've reached the halfway point of our time together today, and it's now time for your questions. So just a couple of reminders. Please type your question in the chat or raise your hand and wait to be called on. Then unmute your line and to ask your question in person. I do have just a couple other reminders for today, and that is that we are not medical professionals. Therefore, we're not able to answer questions about your personal symptoms, maybe a diagnosis that you're trying to achieve or testing. Those types of questions are definitely best answered by healthcare professionals. And just a reminder that the content of this session is for informational or educational purposes only and does not substitute for professional medical advice or consultation with healthcare professionals. And just as that reminder, where that raise hand button is, look for the little smiley face at the bottom there under reactions. Click that and you can raise your hand. And just another reminder that we are going to try to do our best to state our name when asking the question. That will help our ASL interpreters and transcript for everybody to keep clear who is speaking. With that, I'm going to ask that we go into gallery mode as well, so you can see everyone and that you can unpin your interpreter so you'll be able to see if we have anyone who would like to sign their question. Please let us know that too by raising your hand.